Hi, I'm Thanks Too Much, and today we're going to be talking about the Condemned series. Time-wise, the Condemned series isn't really well guarded as a classic franchise, but I think it's very interesting, and it even served as the launch title for the Xbox 360. I think it has a lot of unique ideas and a lot of great premises that simply weren't expanded upon, and I'm going to go into detail as to why. Let's get started.
When the Xbox 360 launched in 2005, it didn't really have that much of a stellar showcase when it came to its launch titles. Perfect Dark Zero turned out to be underwhelming, and games like Call of Duty 2 and Cameo Elements of Power were great games, but they didn't really make people rush out of their homes to buy Microsoft's new system. However, amidst the limited launch titles was a psychological horror game, Condemned: Criminal Origins, a somewhat original, fresh, and much-needed title for the 360. I first heard about Condemned in the March 2005 issue of Game Informer. The developer, Monolith, made this title sound like it was going to revolutionize psychological horror in video games. Monolith were the same creators behind the Fear games, and while Condemned didn't achieve the revolution that they were hoping for, it's still a superbly made title. It gave Microsoft's then new system a title people could hold on to until future titles could take better advantage of the system's new technological capabilities. The game starts out in the fictional Metro City, a city reminiscent of Detroit or New York. You are Ethan Thomas, FBI criminal homicide investigator, and you're on your way to a murder scene committed by a serial killer called The Matchmaker, a sick individual who kills his victims in the company of mannequins. Once you get to the crime scene, you are called by your lab partner Rosa, and she guides you on how to use your forensic tools and investigative techniques to scan and study the area for clues. Your investigation is cut short when you and your FBI partners discover that the killer might still be in the building you're in. You split up for a better chance at catching this criminal, only to realize that there are insane addicts and severely unstable individuals everywhere that will beat you down on sight. There's no reasoning with these people, no talking. You either shoot first or they will cave in your face with whatever blunt object they have. Eventually, you will run out of bullets, so you have no choice but to use whatever melee weapon you can find to defend yourself. Here is where you realize that Condemned's main focus is on first-person melee combat, and the game's first level gives you a taste of what to expect as the game goes on. When you finally catch up to the killer, he ambushes you and drops a cryptic message about righteousness before killing your partners with your gun, framing you for murder. The killer then pushes you through a window which knocks you unconscious. When you wake up, you are back at Ethan's apartment, dragged there by a mysterious man called Malcolm Van Horn, who seems to have a past relationship with Ethan. He advises him to go on the run from the FBI and do his own investigation in order to clear his name. And thus, your adventure begins. The story takes many twists and turns, but you're always on the pursuit of killer, or sometimes even killers, plural. Reading my old March 2005 issue of Game Informer, the original idea was to chase down different serial killers as you played the game. The main character was still Ethan Thomas, and he was still an FBI agent, but instead of clearing his name from murder, he was an agent whose job it was to track down a variety of serial killers. Think of it as a less hardcore version of the Punisher. These killers would have a series of colorful names, such as the Bone Cutter, the Roadside Carver, or the Dumpster Strangler. Now, to be fair, you're still hunting down killers, but not in the variety that the game originally intended. Thankfully, names of the killers who weren't used for story purposes didn't go to waste, as you can see the names in backgrounds with items such as newspaper and magazines if you explore the environment closely enough. This gives Metro City a sense of history when it comes to its crime problem, which makes it feel more grounded in real-life cities. I myself live in Chicago, so I can relate to a city's growing crime rate. The game is a slower pace than originally planned, and while this is different, it isn't wholly a bad thing. On the contrary, the slower pace allows for a grimmer and darker ambiance, and with the new technology brought by the Xbox 360, being in a dimly lit room or hallway has never been so dreadful. At least back in 2005. Microsoft and Monolith wanted to make a huge statement that a game like Condemned could only be possible due to the horsepower of the 360. Today, it might not look that impressive, but back in 2005, Condemned did have many people talking about Microsoft's new console. It wasn't the killer app that Halo was for the original Xbox, but it was just enough for people to at least consider buying 360. It's easy to forget now, but Condemned was the original game that new Xbox 360 owners would reference when justifying purchasing the new console. And all this positive buzz was helped in no small part thanks to Condemned's unique first-person fighting mechanic. Now, to be fair, first-person fighting was done in games before Condemned came into the picture. A little-known game known as Breakdown made this mechanic one of its main gameplay features, and the now classic Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay also combined first-person fighting along with shooting and stealth. But thanks to the new graphical upgrade given by the 360, Condemned showed the brutality of first-person combat in ways that were not seen in games before. Condemned is a one-trick pony, but it's such a well-made and satisfying trick that most people either didn't mind or didn't care. The controls are simple. You block when attacked and strike when an enemy is off balance or their defenses are down. But the game does a fantastic job of putting you in situations that are dangerous, tense, and engaging. To start out, your enemies aren't zombies or monsters, but regular people who for some reason are consumed by rage. This is one of the few ideas that Monolith had since the beginning of Condemned's development that made it through the final game. Your enemies aren't scary because they're monsters. They're scary because they're just like you. They're people who, for some mysterious reason, have been taken over by uncontrolled and extreme anger. This message comes off clearly in the way they attack you. They'll scream, throw random objects at you, and even when you do land a solid hit on them with a pipe or 2x4, they just seem to get angrier. The horror comes by showing the nasty side of human nature. What happens when people can't control their destructive emotions or urges and let them out in ways that harm or even kill others? The game itself labels its common enemies as drug addicts, vagrants, and people with mental instabilities, basically society's most vulnerable people. But there always seems to be some outside force driving these poor souls to the edge of insanity. Something unexplainable that adds to the mystery and horror of Condemned. Unfortunately, the common enemy is too far gone into their own anger to be saved, so you better beat them down before they do the same to you. The word brutal is the only way to accurately describe the first-person melee combat. When you land a hit on an enemy with whatever melee weapon you can find, you feel the hit land with force. Enemies will lose their balance, chunks of meat will fly off, and sometimes enemies will even spit out blood and still come at you, which is both horrifying and impressive. You will still find guns, but guns are a luxury in Condemned. Whenever you find a firearm, your ammo count is limited to what is in the clip, and more often than not, you only have 2 or 3 shots. But the trade-off to that is that bullets kill in 1 or 2 shots, so guns become a strategic advantage when you find them. But Condemned is about the first-person melee combat first and foremost, so it's great that it feels impactful. The first-person view makes the experience of hitting people with wood or steel objects feel really visceral, because you can almost feel the bad things you're doing to other people. Sometimes, if an enemy is wounded enough, you can even finish them off by snapping their necks or slamming their faces on the floor, which takes the brutality to a whole new level. Even to this day, the simple yet effective combat has weight to it. Now, naturally, some parts of the game will feel dated, such as the graphical technology on some of the character models. Everyone in this game looks very stocky or bulky, like if they went to the gym 4 hours a day. But graphical hiccups are to be expected for a launch title, and for the most part, the rest of the game holds up, especially in the variation of grim and dark environments you explore. There are a surprising number of varied locales in Condemned, which is a nice departure from your stereotypical haunted mansions and cemeteries you see in other horror games. You are not an underpowered weakling like in the first Resident Evil games. You are an FBI agent on the hunt for a serial killer, so the different areas you go to give the impression that you are on the chase. You'll go through train stations, abandoned schools, and even a department store that uses its mannequins for really effective scares. Everywhere you go, there is a feeling of dread and paranoia, but the game isn't too dark as to drag down the player's fun. After all, you're playing a game where you bash others in the head with blunt objects. If the environments weren't so varied, the player would have eventually become used to the repeated scenes of deranged lunatics running towards you, yelling incoherent words, and ready to smash you with whatever object they can pick up. but the varied locations you explore do a great job of keeping the repetitiveness at bay. Every time you go someplace new, it's like a maze that you have to navigate through by keeping your eyes open and listening to the smallest environmental cue. You know the crazies are out there, but you don't know where the next attack will come from. This might be the simplest way to build tension, but it works very well here. The darkness in many areas limits your visibility even with your flashlight on, so you'll have to listen for sounds that could be out of place. When you finally hear the deep breaths of an enemy that's only a few feet away, all of a sudden you pay more attention to your environment and hopefully spot where the next attack will come from. In some areas, Condemned will ingeniously use environment-specific scares that your enemies will take advantage of. The department store is such an example. When you first enter it, the department store is completely dilapidated and abandoned. A few Christmas decorations are an eerie and ominous reminder of happier times before the city's criminals became uncontrollable. Some mannequins are still standing in the store, and you can even use their mannequin arms as weapons. But halfway through the level, some of the mannequins come to life, and that's when you realize that the criminals in this level have become so lost in their insanity that they glued plastic to their faces to blend with the mannequins. Now they stand in a still position until they either ambush you or you use your instincts to figure out which mannequins are real and which ones are too real. Speaking of instincts, one piece of Condemned's story focuses on Ethan Thomas's near clairvoyant abilities to somehow quote-unquote see how crimes were committed. Ethan can see into the past of crime scenes, which is helpful in finding clues. From the beginning of the game, you are given vague information on why Ethan has this power. The man you encounter in the beginning of the game, Malcolm Van Horn, will call you via cell phone on various occasions and let you know that you have these gifts, as he calls it. Ethan is encouraged to follow his instincts that will hopefully lead him to reveal the real killer for the murders that he is framed for. Unfortunately, Ethan's near psychic abilities and a couple more secrets revealed later in the game involving Ethan's vocal cords and denser bone structure are his only defining features because as a character, he's kind of boring. He has a tough detective man voice and appearance, but other than that, there really isn't anything special about him. In fact, most of the characters in this game don't have much of a personality other than moving the plot further through stereotypical detective work seen on TV shows like NCIS or CSI. You'll spend a lot of time with Rosa, your lab assistant, but she only calls you when you find clues in your environment that she needs to examine in her lab. She appears in person in one level, the Burnt Library, and even then it's just to help Ethan with more detective work. I understand the seriousness of their situation. After all, Ethan is framed for murder, but from the first time Ethan and Rosa talk, it is implied that these two characters have known each other for quite a bit, and at least some dialogue referring to past events, not FBI related, could have given Ethan and Rosa's relationship a little bit more depth. The ending cutscene does show that Ethan and Rosa have at least a mutual friendship, but by then it's too little too late for their character development. Surprisingly, the character with more development is the serial killer you're chasing who, through plot twists, turns out to be someone completely different named Serial Killer X, or SKX for short, who kills other killers as a form of twisted and poetic justice. He only appears in the game 2 or 3 times, but when he does, his lines are so ominous and his voice so menacing that it sticks with you, making SKX a scary adversary to chase down. It's like listening to a poor man's version of Hannibal Lecter, which is actually a compliment in this case. Okay, so most of the characters might need to find actual personalities for us to relate to them, but chances are you'll be too distracted fighting for your life and solving crime scenes to even care. Ever since Monolith began development on Condemned, they always reference films like Seven and Silence of the Lambs as inspirations for this game. The inspirations from these movies is mainly shown in 2 areas, the detective work and the killer you are trying to chase down. When you reach a crime scene, Ethan's instincts kick in, which lets you know it is time to investigate for clues. The game took some criticism for an oversimplified forensics tool system. This isn't a game like LA Noire. The game holds your hand while investigating crime scenes and automatically picks the forensic tools you'll need to find clues. While this does take away from the satisfaction of solving crime scenes for yourself, The exchange to that is that you can focus on the grisliness of the crime scene itself. You'll investigate your common bloodstains and other bodily fluids, but more often than not, you'll examine dead bodies or parts of dead bodies. As a result, these areas feel like the brutal investigative work from movies like Seven. Ethan and Rosa worked together in Condemned the same way Detective Mills and Detective Somerset worked in the movie Seven, played by Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman respectively. The relationship between Rosa and Ethan might not be as complex or endearing, but it's still nice to have someone other than Ethan be the voice of reason. Even before you play the game, the intro credits for Condemned mirror the intro credits for the movie Seven. One of the many things that made that movie so memorable was the brutality and graphic nature of the murders that the killer, known in the movie simply as John Doe, committed. The killer in the movie Seven used the 7 deadly sins as his MO for committing murder. In Condemned, SKX kills other killers because he gets some sort of sick satisfaction staying one step ahead of Ethan. But SKX doesn't stop there. He goes so far as to use other killers' own MOs against them as a grotesque sense of irony. But even that's not enough for SKX to be ahead of Ethan. He also has to taunt him, going as far as to call him to say how disappointed he is of him. Similar to the scene in Seven when John Doe calls Brad Pitt's character to say how much he admires him. It's a classic cat and mouse game. What many people might not know is that this act of taunting the police for both the game and the movie gets its original inspiration from real life. Killers like the Zodiac Killer in San Francisco and the BTK Killer in Wichita, Kansas were real-life people, and what's most disturbing about them is how normal they seem when at least one of them was finally caught. Both the Zodiac and BTK killers committed horrible crimes, various murders, strangulations, and even sociopathic sexual acts after they killed their victims. But it wasn't enough for these individuals to commit these crimes. They had to taunt the police, who never had enough evidence to figure out who was committing these murders, going as far as to give them clues in a perverted sense of superiority over the law. The Zodiac Killer was never caught, and the BTK Killer was caught almost 30 years after his initial crimes, with his real name revealed to be Dennis Rader. What shocked many people about Dennis Rader was how normal he seemed to be, and yet how unremorseful he was when he confessed his crimes. I mean, this is the same man who hung an 11-year-old girl and masturbated while she was dying. How the fuck can real people be so heartless? Well, for what it's worth, my major in college was criminal justice, and the answer is simple, yet it's one that many people don't want to accept. It's easier to just say that these people are insane, but they're not. An insane person can't elude capture by law enforcement for decades. The real reason real-life killers do what they do is because they can. Plain and simple. They lack complete empathy for the harm they cause others, and they don't care about any other pleasures but themselves. It's all about them, their needs, their pleasures, their wants. They could walk among us and we would never notice because they look and behave just like us. And that is quite possibly the most frightening thing of all. Thankfully, games and movies allow us to explore these disturbing yet oddly fascinating topics without putting us in any real danger. And in the case of games, add psychological tension to make the experience more intense. The psychological horror in Condemned shrouds its story with an ominous, mysterious presence. Throughout the game, there are subtle hints that unknown and frightening forces are at play with people going insane and committing heinous acts of violence. Often you see mysterious figures appear out of nowhere, and even Ethan Thomas himself questions his own sanity throughout the game when this happens. The psychological aspects feel a lot like Silence of the Lambs, even if it's presented very differently. In Silence of the Lambs, the relationship between Dr. Hannibal Lecter and Officer Clarence Starling played a huge part in the psychological tension/horror of the film. Hannibal Lecter is an extremely unpredictable and dangerous individual, but he is portrayed in such a calm and non-threatening manner that it makes him even scarier because you can't tell what's going through his mind. When Officer Starling is assigned to probe Hannibal's mind in hopes of catching another loose serial killer, he plays mind games with her, refusing to help unless she tells him about her life, which she is explicitly told not to do since Hannibal is great at screwing with people's minds. But she takes the chance and confides in Hannibal the reason she wants to catch the other killer before he kills again is because she hopes it puts to rest a traumatic childhood experience she had. The psychological horror in Condemned isn't as deep as the relationship between Hannibal Lecter and Clarence Starling, but it still has the same effect at creating tension throughout the game. It doesn't come with relationships with characters, but from the environment. Every once in a while, Ethan's vision will become somewhat photonegative, and then you start to see human-like beings before they disappear when you get closer. It has the same psychological effect of the game screwing with the player's mind. Since video games are a lot more interactive than movies, there are various opportunities for environmental scares. Sometimes Ethan seems to be teleported to an entirely different plane of existence, a place where the cause of people going crazy might be found, but you never really know. It's not until the final level of the game that you first encounter enemies that aren't your common enraged homeless person. The final boss is a humanoid being with a mixture of flesh and metallic parts. This thing apparently is the cause of why people are going insane. In the Condemned lore, this thing is called the Hate, and Ethan is somehow connected to it. But unless you took time to do some research online, you wouldn't really know because the game doesn't really tell you what this thing is other than the final boss. But when you defeat it, you can't rest on the fact that the violent tendencies in people will stop. Through an odd series of events in the story's final moments, Malcolm Van Horn ties up SKX in the trunk of his car, and it's revealed that SKX is actually the nephew of Malcolm Van Horn, Leland Van Horn. And if you paid attention, you will see that SKX is named after one of the actors that played a minor but very gut-wrenching role in the movie Seven. And like the film, the killer wins. In the movie Seven, John Doe's final kill is based off the sin Wrath, but he doesn't perform the kill. Instead, he forces Detective Mills to kill him in a moment of rage and helplessness. He does this by killing Mills' wife and beheading her before turning himself in. He then ships the head in a box for Detective Mills, hence the now classic phrase, "What's in the box?" Mills gives in to his anger and kills John Doe, ending the movie in a dark and sorrowful tone. However, Condemned gives you the choice to either spare or kill SKX, but in the end, he still wins. If you kill him, you give in to your anger, and you gave in to whatever forces are out there that want people to be consumed by rage. If you spare SKX, he cuts himself loose and pulls a gun on you, but instead of shooting you, he aims the gun at his head and commits suicide. No live SKX, and no chance to learn why he committed the crimes he did. In the final scene of the game, Ethan is cleared of the murder charges, but is hesitant to return to the FBI after all that's happened. Rosa, his one and only friend, checks on him and informs that a cult could be involved with the rise of murders in the city. Though Ethan knows better, or at least he thinks he does, he can't really offer another explanation that won't make him sound crazy. The ending leaves a lot of story questions unanswered, but in a good way, a mysterious way, and in a way that would be explored more in the sequel. Condemned 2 Bloodshot is a great example of a sequel taking almost everything from the original game and improving it to such an extent that it surpasses the first game in nearly every way. Better gameplay, a ridiculous yet fittingly dark story, and improved technology make Condemned 2 stand on top of its predecessor. But a surprising factor that I didn't even take into account until playing through the sequel is returning characters like Ethan, Thomas, and Rosa are actually relatable and even likable to the player. No longer are they just bland personalities only used to move the story forward. The characters in Condemned 2 have strengths, flaws, and even inner conflicts that make them grow as characters. It's been almost a year since the events of the first Condemned. The violence and crime in Metro City has gotten even worse, and our old friend Ethan Thomas isn't any better. After the events of the first game, he has fallen prey to the bottle and is now an alcoholic, homeless, and pissed off individual. This new introduction to Ethan might be a little too dark for some people, but it finally gives Ethan some personality. His descent into self-destruction is understandable if you remember the events of the first game. Even though he was cleared of the murders he was framed for, he still went through a lot of shit that would break anyone, and to top it all off, he lost a finger thanks to SKX. His physical appearance portrays a man who has simply given up on his own life and just wants to be left alone. An ingenious way the game portrays his internal struggles is how his inner demons are personified during moments of anger, vulnerability, and alcoholism, which give you a look into Ethan's thoughts and struggles. His anger and confusion cloud his ability to think straight, which is a situation many of us can relate to. He swears, he's violent, and he is resentful of the fact that people like Malcolm Van Horn used him for their own purposes. And yet, he still comes across as a sympathetic character. But Ethan won't have much time to wallow in his own misery. His old friend Rosa comes back to seek his help in finding Malcolm Van Horn. Before the game begins, an intro cutscene shows Malcolm got himself in some deep trouble with someone or something and calls Rosa for help. The only other person to know Malcolm was Ethan, so he reluctantly agrees to help Rosa in trying to find Malcolm before it's too late. So once again, you return to Metro City, and it isn't any better since the last time we left it. The graphical engine used in Condemned 2 is the same as the original, but modified to make it look a lot cleaner and crisper. Walking through an abandoned building has never felt scarier, lonelier, or nastier than in the sequel. Graphically speaking, the game looks and holds up very well to this day, with the exception of a few blocky shadows here and there. Just like the original, Condemned 2 will take you to various locations like abandoned hotels, bowling alleys, and a cabin in the woods where one of the best parts of the game involving a really big and really pissed off animal occurs. Those who've played the game know exactly what I'm talking about. The story reasons for Ethan going to these locations does enter the realm of ridiculousness, which can put off some people, but it actually helps the game at not getting too dark. After all, you're already playing as an alcoholic who is trying to figure out why the city's crime is out of control, all while battling his inner demons, and coming across some disturbing scenery along the way. If the game gets any more grim, the player might have to check out into some counseling sessions. So to balance the dark nature of the story, you'll also find some humor on TV and radio broadcastings that give you a wider view of what's going on in the city. The player needs to seek these TVs and radios out, but they're not too hard to find, and one of the broadcasters, called Tony Rhodes, is a huge cheeseball. He is your stereotypical news reporter that either purposely or unknowingly makes any situation feel more dangerous than it really is. It's a perfect analogy of real-world news that feed off people's fears more often than actually reporting real news. The humor stems from this reporting getting much of his information wrong due to the fact that Ethan's investigations contradict what Tony Rhodes is saying in his news reports. Most of his reporting isn't even news. It's more like ham-fisted speeches that tell the viewer what they already know. Metro City is going down the shitter due to its crime. What else is new? He eventually gets killed, but his death is met more with laughter since he was a pretty idiotic character to begin with. Thankfully, the main characters are a lot more likable, and their models no longer look bulky thanks to the modified graphics engine and remodeled character designs. All the returning characters have received major physical updates. Ethan looks like hell due to his alcoholism and internal struggles, but Rosa also receives a major facelift. She's slimmer and made more attractive to the player, but she's not sexualized in any way when it comes to her physical appearance, which is an example that should be followed. She's smart, capable, and very likable. She serves very well to offset Ethan's angry nature, and as the story goes on, you feel the friendship these two characters have. In fact, if you look closely while playing the game, you'll see that her first name is Angel, a not so subtle hint that she is Ethan's guardian angel. It might be a little cliched story-wise, but it works here, and after playing the first Condemned, I'm happy to see these two work together, both as colleagues and as friends. SKX eventually makes a return, and he is as fucked up and sick as ever. When you finally find Malcolm Van Horn, he's dead, literally cut open from neck to torso. The culprit, his own nephew, SKX. In fact, SKX goes on another killing spree, murdering not just his uncle, but also the mayor of Metro City. This is where the story really goes off the rails. Turns out there is a cult responsible for people going crazy called the Oro. Now, why they want people to act violently and kill themselves is never clear. It's one of those mysteries that Ethan needs to find out, but apparently the Oro see Ethan as a huge threat to their beliefs. something about his vocal cords and a sonic attack that makes him immune to their influence. The Oro use some kind of sonic devices that screw with people's brains, which causes them to act violently. But Ethan is somehow not affected by these strange machines, and you can destroy some as you progress through the game. Due to Ethan's immunity and special abilities, the main antagonist, known as Dorland, who is secretly a part of the Oro, sends private police units to hunt Ethan down. Dorland is easily the weakest character in the game. He's just your cardboard cutout bad guy. The story is convoluted and hard to follow at times, but there is also a tongue-in-cheek aspect to it. Monolith, who return as developers for Condemned 2, probably knew the story was ridiculous and simply decided to go full out insane. And it works. The story is played seriously by the characters, but the player can't help but smirk as the story reaches new levels of ridiculousness. It walks a really fine line, but it doesn't take you out of the experience, mainly because it gives you a reason to once again bash people in the face with inanimate objects. The first-person combat in Condemned 2 reaches new levels of brutality, and oh dear lord is it more violent. But the violence isn't done in a way that's just for shock value. You're in a city that's falling apart, with individuals that are victims of the Oro who want the city's population to give in to their destructive tendencies. Your common enemy is even more enraged and unpredictable than the first game, and their movements feel more natural, at least for people who have completely lost their damn minds. Their attacks do a lot more damage depending on the difficulty you choose to play, and the highest difficulty will have you on your toes and mastering the art of blocking so you can catch your enemies off balance. Thankfully, you also have a lot more melee weapons at your disposal than the first game. Just like the original game, you can block and strike, but you can also fill up a meter that allows Ethan to unleash a series of attacks that do massive damage. But you'll have to beat up a few bad guys in order to use it. With the exception of cutscenes, everything is seen through Ethan's eyes, so when you unleash any attack, you see the physical damage done to enemies. That means getting up close and personal with more bloodied faces and bruised bodies every time you strike someone with whatever isn't nailed to the floor. The amount of weapons in Condemned 2 is nearly triple of what the original had. You still get basic stats such as reach, damage, and speed, but now you also need to take condition of the melee weapon into account. If a weapon is too damaged from repeated use, it will break and you'll have to use your fists, which is another new inclusion in Condemned 2. At first, it's weird seeing a steel pipe break like glass after downing a few enemies, but it adds a layer of strategy. In the first Condemned, you can stick with one melee weapon you were comfortable with and use it throughout the entire level. But in the sequel, you are forced to use a little more strategy. The weapons aren't so weak that they'll break after just knocking out one enemy, but you will have to eventually use other objects to defend yourself if you keep using the same one for too long. Thankfully, you will have a huge arsenal of weapons to choose from, and this variation gives the combat a lot more depth at choosing the right weapon for certain enemies and can save you from the game over screen. Like the original game, you'll find guns, and for the most part, the only bullets you'll have are what's already in the weapon. However, there are a couple of levels in which you will do some first-person shooting as you are forced to face enemies armed with guns. The shooting itself isn't bad, in fact it's quite satisfying, especially when you land a headshot, but it does take the attention away from the melee combat that the Condemned games are famous for in the first place. You can't reload your weapon in the traditional sense. Instead, you have to scavenge bullets from guns that are left behind from your fallen enemies. This makes using guns tedious, though I can appreciate the sense of realism this mechanic brings. But it still feels out of place for a game series like Condemned. Thankfully, there are only about 2 areas in the game where you have to use guns, and for the rest of the game, finding guns feels more like the first game where you have very limited ammunition and they were more of a luxury than anything else. You can also aim down the sights of guns like in traditional first-person shooters, but there's a twist. Since Ethan is suffering from alcoholism, his hand will shake when you aim down the sight as a side effect of withdrawal. The only way Ethan can steady his aim is by taking a swig of whatever alcohol he can find in his environment. This might make aiming cumbersome, but it adds another layer to Ethan's character. His alcoholism is now a gameplay mechanic that reminds the player that you're playing a broken, rundown man. In fact, as the story progresses, you'll see personifications of Ethan's demons, such as alcoholism, which literally take a twisted form of himself, and it shows the toll that it can take on a man who is consumed by addiction and emotional stress. But this is a video game, and we're playing a story that involves a secret cult hell-bent on making people give in to their violent tendencies, so the sub-story of Ethan's alcoholism is a little rushed, but it is treated with respect, and that's a lot more than most games have done in recent days. Investigating crime scenes has also been greatly improved since the original game, and this time around the sequel has a little more trust in the player to figure things out for themselves. In the first Condemned, the almost insultingly simple forensics tool system meant the player didn't have to think outside the box to look for clues in crime scenes. The sequel trusts the player can figure things out for themselves. Instead of the game choosing tools for the player, you have to choose them for yourself. You'll be guided by Rosa, who is always in contact with you through a field kit that looks a lot like a smartphone, but in the end the player makes the decision for what tools are best to use for certain crime scenes. But it doesn't stop there. Rosa and Ethan go back and forth about how crime scenes were committed, and the game even allows the player to ask certain questions for each situation. This makes the player pay more attention to what they are doing, so you're just as engaged in the forensics as you are when bashing psychos in the head with a baseball bat. Every crime scene is unique, so the player needs to study and pay attention to certain details. It's not brain-busting stuff, but it is enough to feel like you're the one calling the shots. There is a grading system for every investigative situation, and the higher your grade, the better bonuses you'll get at the end of every level. While this means that there is an obvious right answer to every situation, at the very least there is a choice to be made, and if you don't get the high score at the first time through, you can always replay the level and try again. The one odd thing about the investigative portion of Condemned 2 is that Ethan's clairvoyant abilities or instincts from the first game are gone, and no reason is given as to why. The sequel simply goes on without acknowledging this aspect of the first game. From a storytelling perspective, it's very lazy to just drop this element of Ethan's character without any explanation. From a gameplay perspective, it makes sense, since the less information you get while investigating a crime scene, the more the player has to figure things out for themselves. So even if one thing is taken away, there is at least something better to replace it. It's these kinds of differences that help Condemned 2 find its own identity, both as a game and for the Condemned series as a whole. The first game had obvious influences from movies like Seven and Silence of the Lambs that were handled with care and respect, but it also took some identity away from Condemned. But in the sequel, Ethan, Rosa, SKX, and the new characters introduced have their own personalities and specific relationships with each other. The gameplay is as visceral as ever, and even though the story goes bonkers at times, it still serves to make Condemned a unique series overall. Now, to be clear, this is not to say that games shouldn't take inspirations from other media, movies or otherwise. But games are games, and they have to find their own unique identity after subsequent sequels if the players are going to continue being invested in the world that is created for them. Luckily, the developers at Monolith make Condemned 2 something more than just a sequel to the first game. While some of the new characters might not seem as interesting as others, mainly the main antagonist Dorlin, who, as I mentioned before, just turns out to be a cardboard cutout bad guy, the characters we already know are handled with care and given backstories that make them more into real people. Past events from the previous game are used more as reference points to show that there is history behind Condemned 2, and Condemned 2 ends with history that could have served well for a possible third game. Just like the first game, Condemned 2 ends with some questions answered and others not so much. The stage was set for Condemned 3 to not only finish the story, but also refine the Condemned formula and finally make it perfect. Unfortunately, no sequel has ever come out. That is a huge shame, because even if the story went off the rails, the gameplay and the characters were just starting to reach their high points. A third and final game would have closed a chapter on the story of Ethan Thomas and Rosa, even if the game story itself ended up being more batshit crazy than it already is. Hopefully, with the current generation of consoles, Monolith will dust off the series and give us one last game that will close the wacky narrative that is the Condemned 2 story, and give closure to characters that we just started caring for. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please feel free to check out some of my previous videos, and if you like my work, subscribe and share this video with your friends. I could always use some new fans. I hope to see you all real soon.